Let's get to my very special guest today, Devin Sper. Devin, how are you today?
I'm good, Bill. How are you?
I'm just fine, thank you. Let me give you a brief introduction. Devin Sper was born and raised in New York. He lived in Israel for 10 years, has a degree in Jewish history from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and served in the Israel Defense Forces. Since returning to the United States in 1982, Mr. Sper has spoken in defense of Israel to numerous audiences as well as on radio and television. He's the author of the book, The Future of Israel, winner of the 2005 Glyph Award, and of a blog on the Times of Israel website. You can see all his articles, debates, and interviews on his website at Devin Sper, that's DevinSper.wix.com/author. Okay, Devin, you are here obviously because we're going to be talking about the terrorism that's been so too evident that we've been experiencing in the world here. Okay, let me start off by asking you, what is causing the spread of jihadist terror throughout the world, as we have seen most recently now in Paris?
Well, first of all, you have the underlying jihadist ideology. And all the talk in the media about whether they are connected to Al-Qaeda or ISIS or lone wolves is largely irrelevant because they share a common jihadist ideology. But beyond that, what I'd really like to focus today on is the shared tactic of terror. Behind the ideology, there's the question of why have all these groups chosen to attack innocent civilians? And my answer to that is that we have been rewarding, I mean the world, has been rewarding and excusing Palestinian terror for 5 decades. And what we've now seen is that other groups, seeing the success of the Palestinians with terror, adopt the same tactic, and it's metastasized into a global epidemic. You can't legitimize Palestinian terror on the one hand, as the French have, as we in this country have, as many countries have, and not think that a group that has some grievance against you won't adopt the same successful tactic. And so you see, for example, Boko Haram in Nigeria, where they kidnap and enslave those girls. You see Chechen terrorists who committed the massacre at the school in Beslan, Russia, or the attack on the theater in Moscow, or the Boston Marathon bombings. You have Lashkar Taiba, who attacked and committed the massacre at the hotel in Mumbai. And of course, you have Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other groups which have killed tens of thousands.
Okay, Devin, let's continue. What do you think of the large rally in Paris today in solidarity with the victims of the recent jihadist terrorist attacks? And can you please start off by explaining about what was this rally, how big it was, and so on, so people get a flavor of what happened in Paris today?
Well, its last estimates I heard were roughly 1 million people, plus or minus. It included 30 world leaders, including Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, the leader of Mali, the King of Jordan, of course, the President of France. And this was a rally in solidarity with the victims of both the attack on Charlie Hebdo and the kosher grocery. And I tell you that personally, I was watching it this morning on TV and was moved by it. You saw many Muslims participating in it. The first time I remember seeing mass Muslim participation in an anti-jihadist rally. There was a Muslim girl on CNN holding up a sign saying, "I am a Jew," which I found very moving and different, and I would say about time. But having said that, the question going forward is, will they tomorrow after this rally continue to excuse Palestinian terrorism? If they do that, then the message that jihadists everywhere will receive is that despite their words at the rally, terrorism is a legitimate form of expression, and that will be counterproductive.
Okay, there's a question from a longtime listener, Alberto in the Netherlands. I'm just going to read it word for word, and then you can answer as you see fit. He says, "This afternoon I'm watching what happened in France. What is Abu Mazen doing there?" And then he's got another question, but why don't you go ahead and answer that first question?
Well, for the sake of the audience, Abu Mazen is the head of the Palestinian Authority, and that's an excellent question. And I asked myself that question when I saw it, because Abu Mazen is a former terrorist who's been legitimized. handed a state, handed a seat at the UN, and his organization, Fatah, is a terrorist organization. And it's not just that it was a terrorist organization, it's still a terrorist organization. They still carry on attacks all the time against Israeli civilians. So on the one hand, they have this rally against terrorism. On the other hand, they invite the head of a terrorist organization. And that's exactly the kind of mixed message that the world is sending that I'm talking about.
Well, of course, Devin, you realize that had this been an attack on some newspaper in Israel with the same casualties, believe me, there would not be this worldwide support against terrorism like we've seen in Paris. I don't think there's any question about it, because look how often there have been attacks against Jews and Israelis. You just don't get this. You're not going to get some Muslim woman putting up a sign, "I am a Jew," because Jews were killed in Israel. The only reason that you have this is because of the attack on the French newspaper.
Well, first of all, you're right. Secondly, there have been numerous attacks on French Jews recently. There was an attack on a school in Toulouse. There was an attack on the museum in Belgium by a returning ISIS member. And this has been, especially the last year, has been increasing in frequency. So I agree with you completely. Having said that, what happened in Paris is good. It's possibly a turning point. But if they continue to separate and excuse and reward Palestinian terrorism, that message will be stronger. And my point is not the hypocrisy of what's going on, which is apparent to anyone with two eyes. My point is the counterproductiveness of excusing and rewarding Palestinian terrorism, because it comes back to bite the very people who are doing it.
Okay, after the break, I'm going to ask you to explain how Palestinian terrorism has been rewarded. But I want to get to the second part of Alberto's question. He also says, are there any Jews who are doing what most or some Muslims doing in this world, or Jews that attack a newspaper and shooting journalists?
Not that I know of. And generally speaking, I don't see Christians doing that either. I think this is a unique phenomena within Islam, and it's up to the Islamic world to deal with it. And we've seen the first signs with the statement by the president of Egypt, with the attendance by some Islamic leaders at this rally in Paris, that they may realize that themselves. In other words, they may realize that this is blackening the name of Islam, and that it is in their interest to expel, expunge, as the president of Egypt said, jihadism from their religion. But again, if they make an exception with Israel, that will be counterproductive, and it will undermine everything they're seeking to do.
And I have heard what General Sisi of Egypt has stated, and I just hope and pray he does not receive the same fate that Anwar Sadat did, because he entered into the peace treaty with Israel. We have a world where we have these terrorists who have absolutely no value to human life. They slaughter whenever they can. And it's just a mindset that I don't think we can really understand in the West.
Well, that's true. I would say Sisi, he's aware of what happened to Anwar Sadat. He probably has security. His rivals are the Muslim Brotherhood, who are very dangerous. And so Sisi is not a guy to be holding candlelight vigils. Sisi is a guy to defend himself and take action. And I think it ironic that the United States has boycotted his government, has refused to sell arms to his government, and after he overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood, we've cut off aid to Egypt, and of course it should have been the other way around.
Okay, Devin, we are coming up with the first break. Welcome back to this very interesting and important edition of Middle East Radio Forum. What's happened in the last week in France is just, it's not unbelievable, because it's something that's expected. I'm sure a lot of people aren't aware of what goes on with terrorism around the world, but this is something that is not surprising, unfortunately. We are taking your calls throughout the hour, so please get your calls in now. My very special guest is Devin Sper. And Devin, let's continue with the discussion. Why do you say the world has excused Palestinian terrorism?
Look, for over 5 decades, Palestinian terrorists have killed approximately 10,000 Israelis. And they've done this, and I'm not talking soldiers, that's simply civilians. And they've done that in the most brutal possible ways. So, for example, there were Israeli citizens that were hacked to death with axes in the town of Beit Shean. In the town of Nahariya, a baby was grabbed from her mother's arms and her head smashed against a rock in front of her mother. Recently, they have a new tactic of driving cars into people or heavy equipment into traffic. In that way, in November, they killed a 3-month-old baby who happened to be an American citizen. There are home invasions. There are tens of thousands of rockets that they've launched targeting Israeli cities, mortars as well. More recently, from Gaza, they dug tunnels under Israel, including under a kindergarten and a nursery, with the aim of coming out through the tunnels, kidnapping people, and murdering them and holding them hostage. And it was only because of the war in Gaza that was stopped. Now, in all this time, in over 50 years, the United Nations has not once condemned one of these Palestinian attacks. On the contrary, they've passed 40 resolutions since 1972 condemning Israel. So they're condemning the victims of the attack rather than its perpetrators. And that is why I say they're excusing Palestinian terrorism. They are condoning it by not condemning it and by condemning its victims.
Okay, Devin, well, let me follow up on that. To me, in my simplistic, perhaps, way of looking at things, these people live in the vicinity of Israelis, these terrorists, and Israel certainly has a military to take care of them. Why does Israel allow the Palestinians who want to kill Israelis and do the things that you've just described and that will continue to do in the future, why do they allow these Palestinians to live in proximity to the Israelis where they have access to the Israelis? I can't imagine any other country allowing this to happen. Why does Israel do it? And you mentioned how Israel is the only one condemned. Israel's going to be condemned anyway, so why does it not protect its citizens?
I agree with you, but you and I are not running the country. They have a different opinion. In their defense, they're under tremendous pressure from the world, precisely as I've just described, and they're under a microscope, and whatever Israel does is condemned. If Israel conducts an operation of legitimate self-defense, as in Gaza, the world focuses on 1 or 2 cases of collateral damage rather than the thousands of Israelis that Hamas has killed in the meanwhile. And they're oversensitive to this, and I completely agree with you. What they need to do is just go for it, since they're being condemned anyway. It's like the boy who cried wolf. They're going to condemn you anyway, so you need to do what you need to do. But I'm not the Prime Minister of Israel, and it's not my place to tell them what to do. But what I can do, and what all of our listeners can do, is defend them in the court of public opinion from the vilification and unjust demonization which her enemies spread about her. And their goal with this demonization, their goal with these 40 votes of condemnation against Israel, is to demonize her. And you demonize someone because you intend ultimately to murder them. And that prepares the way for your atrocity.
Well, that's exactly, of course, what the Nazis did to prepare Germany and other countries to destroy the Jews. They totally demonized and dehumanized the Jews that were living in Europe.
Just so, and just as the Nazis spent some years demonizing the Jews prior to the Holocaust, the Palestinians have been on a campaign for many years to demonize Israel.
But I still haven't gotten a good answer, and perhaps I'm not understanding what you're saying, but I still haven't gotten a good answer to the situation that Israel's going to be condemned anyway.
No, but your question is a good question, but you're addressing it to the wrong person. I'm not in charge of Israeli policy.
What I don't understand is why Israel isn't willing to take care of business and protect its people totally, which it certainly could do. And it's just something that blows my mind, because all these people continue to be killed. It seems like now might even be a good time to do it, with the world focused on what happened in France. Maybe the world understands a little bit better of why you have to deal directly with the terrorist threat and prevent it from happening in the future.
Let me just say again, also in their defense, that the whole Republic of France, with all 88,000 soldiers they sent out to find these guys, couldn't find them. They knew they were already listed as jihadists, and they didn't prevent it. The United States, with all its resources, has been unable to prevent the 9/11 and the attack on the USS Cole and many other attacks. Israel is in the middle of their neighborhood. Israel is in the middle of the Middle East. Israel is next door to ISIS and in Al-Qaeda's backyard, and is surrounded by them. So if it's difficult for the French and difficult for the United States to deal with, how much more difficult would it be for the Israelis to handle? And they're a much smaller country. And yet they do a better job of it than do the French or the other Europeans.
Okay, well, that's a question we'll have to continue to explore here on Middle East Radio Forum. And I know Dr. Carroll will have something to discuss about it next Sunday when he is the main guest. Okay, let's just move on to another question. Devin, where do you see parallels between Palestinian terrorism against Israel and the current wave of jihadist terror sweeping the world?
There are too many parallels to list, but I will just name a few that are recent and in the listeners' minds so you can see what I mean by that. This November, 2 Israeli residents of Jerusalem, including, as I mentioned, a 3-year-old baby, were run over in a new spate of Palestinian drive-over attacks against Israelis. The result of this was not condemnation by France or the EU or the United Nations, but on the contrary, a month later, actually a few days later, the EU's court declared that the Palestinian Hamas is no longer a terrorist organization, and they cited for this lack of evidence. And what was the result of that? 3 days after that, a driver yelling Allah Akbar drove into 11 pedestrians in Dijon, France. In other words, emulating what had just happened and been rewarded in Israel. The day before that, a similar thing had happened in Jeux-les-Tours, and the next day, the same thing happened in Nantes. So what you have is a direct cause and effect. This happens in Israel, it's rewarded by the EU, and then it occurs in the EU. Another example is the attack just recently on the Lindt Cafe in Sydney, Australia. And as soon as I saw that, it reminded me of the attack on the Sbarro pizza place in Jerusalem in 2001. And then more recently, you had the massacre of 145 school children in Peshawar, Pakistan by the Taliban. And I immediately thought of the 1974 Ma'alot massacre, in which Palestinian terrorists murdered 25 hostages at an Israeli school. So in other words, these tactics have worked for them in Israel. They not only haven't been punished for these, but they've been rewarded, and they're therefore now being emulated by other groups all over the world.
Okay, Devin, I've got to stop you there. We are coming up upon the next break. Welcome back to this very interesting and important edition of Middle East Radio Forum. Unfortunately, with all the terrorism going on in France and elsewhere in the world, that is the subject. We certainly cannot and do not ignore tough subjects. My guest in studio is Devin Sper. He's the author of an absolutely terrific book, The Future of Israel. I highly recommend it. I actually have read it twice because I think it's so important. But Devin, can we go through some calls?
Please.
Okay. First up is Roy from Glendale. You're on the air.
Hello. Marching is cheap. Printing signs is cheap. I'll believe that the French and the British and the Germans and whatnot are serious against terrorists when they give the guns back to the police force in France and Britain.
All right, Roy, I do need your question. What is your question, though?
Well, my question is, when are the French and the British and the Germans going to have some testicles and do something instead of just talking?
All right, thank you, Roy.
That's a good question, Roy. I agree with you that talk is cheap. On the other hand, let me also say that words are important. Just as we say that slander against Israel is important, so too positive words like we see in Paris are important. So I don't completely discount it, but you're right in this sense. It's only a first step. If it's not followed by action, it doesn't mean anything. And if it's not followed by a consistent condemnation of terror across the board, including terror against Israel, then it's meaningless.
Okay, thanks for that call, Roy. Let's go now to Steve from Northwest Phoenix. Please be brief with your question.
Yeah, gentlemen, Friday night, Geraldo Rivera, a very prominent Jew, gets on O'Reilly and tells the American people that we cannot associate one bit Hamas with the terror that was in France this week. What is he thinking?
Well, let me state before Devin takes that. The fact that he may be Jewish, I think one of his parents is Jewish, the fact that he may be famous doesn't mean he has any understanding of the situation. Go ahead, Devin.
I didn't hear that, and I'm glad I didn't hear that on the news because it would have annoyed me to no end. That's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. And obviously, if I could sit here and debate Geraldo Rivera on that, in very short order, we could get him to understand the illogic in what he's saying. But it's like Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, said. If you repeat something enough times, people begin to believe it. And so there are a lot of people out there who think that there's some justice, A, in the Palestinian cause, and that B, somehow it's justified in their case. Terrorism is justified in their case. And they make an exception, and it's very sad to see a Jew, of all people, make an exception when terrorism is used against the Jews. But, historically, the Jews are often the canary in the coal mine. And just as when the Nazis first came after the Jews, and then they came after the Catholics, and then they came after the homosexuals, and then they came after the Serbs and the Russians, ultimately, if people allow this to go and be done to the Jews, then it will be done to them. And that's what we saw in Paris.
All right. Thanks for that question, Steve. Let's quickly go to Jock calling from Scottsdale. You're on the air.
Yes, Mr. Sper, you've stated the thing I wanted to about Israel being, or the Jews being the canary in the coal mine. Isn't this an opportunity for Netanyahu to really take that principle and convince all the Europeans and the United States, that it is important why they should be supporting Israel rather than taking the position of supporting the Palestinians?
Okay, that's an interesting question, Jock. I will have a response after Devin answers you.
My answer, Jock, is yes. And I've been carefully watching Netanyahu and hoping to hear that, and haven't heard that. He comes out and said the other day that this shows that the world has to fight jihad. But he's not connecting the dots for people in the way you just did. I think it's critical. This is the time that Netanyahu should come out and say that just as we condemn jihadist terror in Paris, you have to condemn it in Israel, and point out the hypocrisy.
And I think it's very important that this be done. And the problem is I don't think the world listens when Israelis talk. Netanyahu can say what he wants, but I think there are such deep-seated anti-Semitic, thoughts within the Europeans that it's really not going to do any good. I hope I'm wrong. Devin, please be brief. We're coming up on the next break.
I want to address what you just said, Bill. Netanyahu in his book addresses that point, and he says that it's true that they don't listen and they don't want to hear what the Jews say, but at least your supporters, those listening on this show, will know what to say. At least some of them will listen. And so you state the truth, and you state the truth, and you state the truth again, and that is the tactic. The fact that they're not listening, you can't help. But some are listening. There are fair-minded people out there, and there are people whose hearts are with Israel, and they need at least to be given the ammunition to make the public debate.
And I think it's important also to contact your representatives in Congress, contact your president, even though he won't be listening to you about this issue, and tell them what needs to be told. Okay, we are coming upon the final break. Welcome back to the final segment of today's very important edition of Middle East Radio Forum. My name is William Wolf, your host every Sunday, noon to 1 o'clock Arizona time. My guest is author Devin Sper. Again, he wrote a terrific book called The Future of Israel. I highly recommend it. Devin, let's get to some more questions. Joel from Phoenix, go ahead. Please be brief.
Yes, we have a funny way of using words. We use the word organization. In my mind, organization usually goes with the word charitable organization. Aren't we legitimizing these terrorist groups by calling them a terrorist organization? Thank you.
All right, Joel, thank you.
I don't really think so. We talk about a criminal organization, a mafia organization. So I don't think that the word organization in itself is a judgment. It's the adjective you put before it.
Okay, thanks again for the question, Joel. Let's quickly go to Marty calling from Phoenix. Marty, you're on the air.
Good day, gentlemen. Can you shed any light for us on why President Obama will not take a more demanding and outraged stance on these Islamic attacks in Europe and on Israel? He should be doing that. Thank you very much.
All right,
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Marty. I'll have some comments after Devin.
Actually has taken a stand on the attacks in France. But my point that I've been making for the entire segment here is that he and others are not doing the same thing when it happened in Israel. As many people have been killed in attacks recently in Israel as in France, and more so, and we heard nothing and no rallies and no world leaders condemning it. So there is a double standard. And the point I'm trying to make is not only is this double standard hypocrisy and morally wrong, but it's counterproductive because it's encouraging these other groups to follow in the same path and tactic as the Palestinians who are being rewarded for it.
Okay, and let me respond based upon your question here. I think it's important, and I've said this many times on the show, pull up President Obama's Cairo speech right after he was first sworn into office 6 years ago. That really tells you where his heart and soul is. Very, very philo-Islamic, very much in favor of Islam. He said that we'll never be at war with Islam. Well, President Obama, I hate to tell you, Islam is at war with the West and the United States as well as Israel. And until we recognize that we are in a war, you can't fight it. How are you going to fight a war that you don't know is happening? I think it's very clear. And I, again, urge everybody, go to YouTube, pull up President Obama's speech in Cairo, and that will tell you what you need to know in that regard. Okay, Devin, let's continue with the questions here. How has world reaction to Palestinian terror differed from terror perpetrated by other groups? And what I'm talking about, the world seems to have excused, has not excused other type of terrorism, just the Palestinian terrorism. What's going on?
Well, let me give you an example, because I keep saying that, but let me give an example to prove that. Let's look at the way the world acts towards the Islamic State and towards Hamas. Now, Hamas is a terrorist organization. It openly calls for Israel's obliteration, which is, in essence, a call for genocide against 6 million Jews. And it acts on that. It's perpetrated innumerable suicide bombings and rocket attacks on Israeli civilians, killing thousands. And Palestinians in Gaza who oppose Hamas are summarily executed, and often in very brutal ways. Recently, Hamas kidnapped and murdered 3 Israeli teens. And the State Department reaction was, spokesman Jean Psaki said, we feel all sides should exercise restraint. In other words, she draws a moral equivalence between Hamas terror and its Israeli victims. So that's how they deal with Hamas. They obfuscate, they either say nothing or they obfuscate and draw an equivalence. Now, how do they deal with the Islamic State? Well, this is what President Obama said after the beheading of an American journalist. Let me quote, "No grievance justifies these actions. There can be no reasoning, no negotiation with this brand of evil. The only language understood by killers like this is the language of force. So the United States of America will work with a broad coalition to dismantle this network of death. The terrorist group known as ISIL must be degraded and ultimately destroyed." So, on the one hand, ISIS cannot be reasoned with, cannot be negotiated with, and must be destroyed. On the other hand, Hamas and the PLO must be reasoned with, must be negotiated with, and must be handed concessions. This is the sort of double standard and double message that they're sending. And what's the result of that? ISIS doesn't listen to what President Obama says. It watches what he does. And in seeing the reward to Hamas that we and the European Union and the UN have given to Hamas and the PLO by legitimizing them and handing them land and handing them a seat on the United Nations and in other international bodies, ISIS says, well, maybe if I follow that path, I too will get legitimization and world recognition and a seat at the UN.
Okay. It's just a situation where there's always a differentiation in the world between Israel and any other country. Israel is not a normal country. It's not treated as a normal country. It's always the whipping boy, and all you have to do is look at the condemnation of Israel in the United Nations. Where are the condemnations, the resolutions directed? Always at Israel, never the Palestinians, or very rarely against any Arab terror. Okay, let's get to another question. What has been the consequence of this coddling and rewarding of Palestinian terrorism? I think you've already touched on it, but go ahead and flesh it out.
Well, yes, I have touched on it because, as I was saying, if the PLO and Hamas and Hezbollah, which have conducted the sort of brutal 50-year campaign against Israel that we've seen, are given land and legitimacy and a seat at the UN, then why shouldn't Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram and Chechnyan jihadists and Lashkar-e-Taiba and all the rest believe that similar tactics are going to be their path to world recognition? If Yasser Arafat was given a Nobel Peace Prize, which he was, then we might ask, why not ISIS leader al-Baghdadi? Might not he imagine that he too will one day get a Nobel Peace Prize. And that sounds ridiculous, but it's no more ridiculous than Yasser Arafat getting a Nobel Peace Prize. So the point is, if this has worked for the Palestinians, and of course people condemn these things when the Palestinians do them, but they act by rewarding them and therefore encourage other groups to do that. There are many groups out there, and not only Islamic groups, who have grievances. And if you legitimize terror as a tactic and reward it, then every group that has a grievance against you may take up that tactic. The only way to defeat terrorism is for the civilized world to say that terrorism is not acceptable, period. As to again quote Obama, there is no grievance that justifies these actions. And that should be Israel's line. I once heard Netanyahu say that. He doesn't say it often enough, but he was asked by a reporter, well, didn't these terrorist incidents happen because this, that, or the other thing? And he said to the reporter, is there any grievance in your mind that justifies murder of innocents? And the reporter had to say no. And that was the end of that debate. And that's the answer. There is no grievance. And I can sit here and debate you all day long on how real the Palestinians' grievance are and how self-manufactured they are. But that's not our issue today. The question is, whatever you think your grievance is, you do not have the right to murder innocent people over it. And unless that is the standard that the world adopts, then it's going to be bad for the world.
Okay. Devin, let's take another caller. Steve from Phoenix. Go ahead. You're on the air.
Hi, Devin, Steve Greenberg. I love your book.
Thank you, Steve.
My question concerns the complicity that the media in our country has by exalting all these terrorists every time there's an event like this, by showing their pictures all over the place all the time. I can just imagine thousands of jihadist wannabes, losers, in basements all across the Middle East saying, oh, look at them, they're getting their 15 minutes of TV. How do we address the way the media is complicitous in expanding this?
All right. Thanks for your question, Steve.
That's a tough question because it's the nature of the media to want publicity and ratings and sensationalism, and it's therefore in their nature to take any picture they get like that and broadcast it. You're asking them to show a responsibility that is not really their purview and their specialty. I don't really have a good answer for that question. I wish I did, but I don't think realistically the media will ever stop doing that.
Well, that's what the media does. And,
right. That's the animal. That's the nature of the beast.
Yeah, and we just I'll look forward when the media is covering how Israel is taking care of business and really has done what's necessary to protect its own people. But that's for another show. Devin, does the world understand that it's sending mixed messages on terrorism?
I don't think it does. I think that if the French understood the consequences of their support of Palestinian terrorism, if they understood that there's a direct connection, as I explained, between that and the terrorism against France itself, they wouldn't do it. But I don't think they quite get that. Or let's say this, if they do get it, they don't understand the consequences of it. So, look, there was a time, which we can all remember, before 9/11, when Israel was the only country really being targeted by terrorism. And what happened is that countries like France believed that they could appease Palestinian terrorists by expressing sympathy for their cause and by condemning Israel and pressuring her to make concessions. And not only France, but the United States and most of the world have that policy, and I have to say, still have that policy as of today, and they persist in that policy of coddling Palestinian terrorists, despite the total failure of that policy, not only to bring peace to Israel and the Palestinians, but the total failure of that policy to end terrorism in the world. On the contrary, it's, as I've explained, fueled terrorism. Now, in the last year in particular, terrorists switched from attacking Israel, which is a hard target, to attacking softer targets in France itself and in Europe itself, in Belgium, in Germany, in England, in Sweden. And yet the French media and elites still didn't wake up to that. And I mention the media and elites because I think the French people probably get it. And I think in the next election they may elect Jean-Marie Le Pen, and you're going to see the far right sweep the elections in Europe because the average people do get it. But the media and elites are politically correct to the point that they won't acknowledge what's going on, not just in Israel, but even in their own country. So every time there's been an attack on Jewish institutions in France, this is not the first attack. It just got publicity because it happened in conjunction with the attack on Charlie Hebdo. But every time this has happened in the past, the media in France has portrayed this, if they've portrayed it at all, as a criminal matter, as a robbery, as a simple criminality, and they ignore the underlying jihadist ideology that's common to all these groups, including the Palestinian groups like Hezbollah and Hamas.
Okay, let's conclude with this last question here. What should the world's policy towards Palestinian terrorism be going forward from this point?
Well, as I think you can extrapolate from what I've said until now, the policy has to be that whatever you think of the Palestinian issue, that you condemn and do not reward Palestinian terrorism, whether it's directed against Jews in Paris or New York or Israel. And that if you don't want this tactic to spread to other groups around the world, then you have to condemn it. If you don't do that, then you are going to soon enough find the same tactic visited on yourself.
Okay, get your crystal ball out, Devin, and where do you think that this terrorism that's been going on now in France that's targeted non-Jewish targets, where do you think it's going to be leading in the next 6 months to a year?
That's a really good question. I think the rally in France is a hopeful sign. I may be overly optimistic, but I think the French are not just showing sympathy for the victims, but they're standing up for the first time in a long time, and they're saying that they are not afraid of jihadists and that they are going to isolate and fight them. If they do that, and as I said, you're seeing a rise of the right in Europe, and I think that's a good thing as long as it's not the extreme and the fascist right, but the responsible right. I think if they end this political correctness in the media and among their politicians, they can certainly defeat jihad in their own countries, and we can certainly defeat it here, and Israel can defeat it if we all work together. But whether that's going to happen, because I'll tell you what, the jihadists are going to redouble their efforts. They don't like what they saw in Paris today with this rally. They don't like Muslims coming out and holding up signs saying, "I too am a Jew." The whole point of their attack in France was to find a reaction against the Muslim population that would then win them recruits. And this is exactly what they don't like. I'll tell you another thing they don't like.
All right, quickly, please.
The other result of this is that there's been a great emigration of Jews from Europe, and that is going to increase tenfold next year. And so you have Hamas and you have Hezbollah actually coming out and condemning what happened in France. It's not that they don't do the same thing themselves, but they themselves realize the counterproductive nature of what's going on, and they're very worried about how this actually strengthens Israel.
Okay, Devin Sper, thank you very much for a terrific presentation. Briefly tell the people how they can access your book, The Future of Israel.
I have a website, which is www.devinsper, that's devinsper.wix.com/author. And you'll have a link to my book. You'll have a link to all my articles and all these interviews I've done on Bill and other shows, as well as television interviews and debates and speeches, including videos. And if you want the book only, you can simply go to Amazon.com and look up The Future of Israel by Devin Sper.
Okay, thank you very much, Devin. And if you missed any of the information, as always, you can send me an email, radioforum@aol.com, and I'll get back to you.